Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Coach's Corner. We've got the whole gang here as usual, and today we're going to be going over the Japanese meta, or Japanese Smash meta to be more specific. So I'm really excited to get into this episode. Bam and I actually just got back from Kagaribi 10 not too long ago. It was a extremely fun tournament. That was the first big, or that was my second time in Japan, but the first really big tournament I've been to. Usually their big tournaments are like Umibora, Kagaribi off the top of my head. I think they have a handful of other ones, but the first time I came, it was me and Void, and we went to a bunch of different locals, and we just went to different Smash Fest. So this is the first really big tournament I went to, and it was a great experience. And being in person was really cool, and just experiencing the scene in person. I think the biggest thing I could see that I couldn't see on like a webcam or just like on a stream is the scene's passion. They have a lot of passion for the game. They just love the game, and it really shows, right? So yeah, I guess we can Bam, how was your experience at Kagaribi 10?
I mean, yeah, it was amazing. For me, yeah, it's my second big FGC event I've been at. The first one being Evo Japan. It's been my like fourth time there now, but like that for me was short. I know you were there for a longer time, but I was there literally for 2 days and then did pretty much. Yeah. But it's work stuff, man. I don't want to talk about it. I'm very sad that I had to leave early.
Bro.
But even in that time, I got to reconnect with some people, and like I had a phenomenal time, man. That scene has always been incredible, and I think for me. It's been a while since I've just seen I like I said, it was my like first Smash like major tournament that I was there for. So to kind of see what has taken place since connecting with some of those guys, going back to like even like Charles, and you can talk this too, but like even our like 2GG days and like working alongside a lot of the Japanese players and make sure to bring them out there, and even further back, just kind of supporting and showing the homies love. Ayuha, who is a like one of the godfathers of the Japanese scene, and to kind of see where he's gone, and we keep in touch now every now and then, and to see what has like come from all that hard work and that hustle and that ambition, and straight up for all you old heads, like being in a freaking back of freaking like moving trucks just to get to tournaments, dude. Like it's absolutely insane what they've been able to carve out in this space, and it's a beautiful thing. A very unified scene. Yeah, I had a great time. It was amazing.
And then were you guys, Ramses and Tony, were you guys able to stay up really late? I mean, for EU time, was it that late? I'm not too sure how the time difference works for Japan to EU.
I woke up at like 7 a.m. and I could watch like a little bit of top 4. So it basically is like super early, but it was good. Yeah, that event was crazy. I think this was I might be wrong, but it was one of the first events where I was really like impressed by the production value. And I might be wrong in this, but it feels like one of the first events where they really like cared about putting on a show internationally. Of course, like before they had events that were like, hype and they had everything. But in this situation, like the graphics were just that much more cleaner. The stream technician was on point with everything. They had American casters specifically on location as well. I don't know if you guys were like, invited there, but either way, I think they did a really, really good job presenting the event to everyone. I had a great time watching. What about you, Tony?
So for me, it was a matter of waking up early in the morning. I basically just worked out cheering on the Buzz and Spargo in top 8. It was the ideal way to wake up in the mornings.
Yeah.
Yeah, we had some surprise picks in top 8 and a lot of upsets, obviously, as well. And I also forgot to shill in the beginning. So if you guys do enjoy the content, make sure to subscribe, like the video, and make sure to tell us what you thought about Kagaribi 10 or the Japanese Smash meta in general. So I think the first topic I want to go over is the lack of skill gaps. I think in Japan, how do I explain like lack of skill gaps? Essentially, among their top players, there's always skill gaps between like certain sections, right? Like maybe top 2 in a region, then there's a gap into like top 10, into a gap into like stuff like that, right? So these skill gaps in Japan, I think they have the least amount of skill gaps, and the skill gaps are very small in Japan. So a lot of times when you watch the event, even if you watched pools, there was top 10, top 5 seeds popping off after they got a 3-0 and they secured their spot in winner side bracket for the second day, because yes, it is that hard to get out of pools in Japan because the skill floor is so high in that region that there's so many players that got upset, whether they're a top 10 seed, top 50 seed. And I mean, if you looked at the upset threads, it was insane. There was so many different upsets throughout especially first day. And then obviously the upsets continued to roll out through the second day. But yeah, just the skill floor in this region is so high. And I think there's a lot of factors to that. I think Tokyo specifically has a very large advantage when it comes to improving as a Smash player. Their internet is better than US's internet. I don't know how the internet is in EU, but I know that in terms of comparing it to like US to Japan, Japan has a better internet, and on top of that, it's just a much smaller location, right? So it's not like you're connecting East Coast, West Coast, and I'm sure in Europe it's like not everyone's in one country, right? So you're connecting country to country, and that just gets more difficult, right?
The thing about Japanese internet infrastructure, last time I looked into it, is that they've optimized their internet structure to work well within Japan, which is also like if you try to load a Japanese site from like Europe or from the US, it loads extremely slowly. And that's because they've optimized it all to kind of like work quickly within Japan. And that's also like an advantage when they play online games. So that's why their Wi-Fi is so good. It's not even like their stats are better than ours or whatever. It's just because like their infrastructure is optimized to work within the country. Yeah.
So, and then on top of that, the public transportation, very safe,
insane,
very safe, very affordable, very efficient, right? So as a visitor, it felt really nice to just be at any given point, be able to just go out and visit any one of the sub-cities within Tokyo, right? And it just feels limitless in terms of where you can go. And then on top of that, for going to Smash tournaments, all these like locals in Tokyo, that's why a lot of their top players will show up to a lot of these locals. And because of that, you have that along with the good online, along with even an infrastructure. They have a ladder system. I forget what it's called, but there's an online ladder system very similar to Anther's ladder.
Smashmate.
Yeah, there's
Smashmate.
Yep. So that, and people take that very seriously. So it's another like structured way to practice and grow as a player. So I think all of this stuff is finally catching up to, especially in the world of Ultimate, right? Because I feel like in Brawl and Smash 4, the online, the Wi-Fi for those games weren't as good, so they didn't get to reap as much benefits, right? That's how I feel. And I think Ultimate's online is just, it should definitely be better than Smash 4 and Brawl. I don't know all the exact stats, but from my Wi-Fi experience from playing like Smash 4, and I played Brawl in like Hawaii and that was like trash, but Smash 4 going to Ultimate, it's not a huge jump, but it is a better jump, right? And I think that also just helps Japan as well. And then Ultimate being so popular on top of that, so more people are just playing online in Tokyo, so I think that also helps a lot. So I think as time went on, all of these advantages of living in Tokyo kind of scaled up, and now here we are in Ultimate, right? And now Japan is just one of the biggest threats, and maybe they were always one of the biggest threats, and they just didn't get the opportunities like in Smash 4, right? Bam alluded to 2GG, giving a lot of, kind of being the bridge from Japan to US and tried to bring out
and Frostbite. Shout out to Frostbite.
And Frostbite as well, right? So there was also some of these US entities that were trying to bring out Japanese talent because we knew they were good, but they just never got the chances to compete out into the US. So now a lot more of those opportunities are happening, and all of these other advantages are kind of scaling with Japan, and I think now they're an incredible force in Ultimate. I think they're overall the strongest region, or I guess strongest country, I should say, right? Because region is a very loose term, to say the least, right? So I would say they're the strongest country, and I don't think it's like by far anything, but it's interesting to see because they haven't always been the strongest country, right? So what are your thoughts, Bam, on like the skill gaps and all that other stuff?
Definitely. I'm in the same way where, like, for the most part, that I think that they've always been in contention to be like some of the strongest, period, right? And it's definitely been a situation where now it seems like yeah, they're the number one, right? And I think like no one really bats an eye if someone says that. And I do agree with what you're saying as well. With all stuff aside, this with online being more like prevalent, them having great infrastructure like supported. Obviously, they just like a lot of times Japan, they just make these things for Japanese people and they make sure that it's optimized for Japanese people. So it's really good there, right? And it works well there. So obviously, combination of that, combination of the seriousness of how they take the game as well too, right? It just allows it. It just builds up a ecosystem where people are going to continue to get strong. When we talk about the, for example, for US, right? We go state to state. You have a couple people who are ahead of the rest, and then after a while, they usually go through the idea of like, hey, why do I even go there to play these people? I'm not going to locals anymore, and that's the end of that. Then it's like you'll see them once in a blue moon. They'll pop up for the regional to get the money, and then they'll go about their day, right? And really they only get good practice when they like travel with people or maybe they play online with some people. Being able to consistently have that presence and that camaraderie, right? And knowing that you're playing for that excellence, having a gaming culture like Japan in that way, particularly just fighting game culture too, like that translates over as well. A lot of those guys are heavily influenced by that. And even if they weren't a part of the arcade culture, it influenced how they go about these things and how they connect and how they build and how they grow together. Even with online being better in some of these games, these guys still come over and play each other all the time. Versus US, when you see a game that usually gets really strong and it has good internet, people just don't go to hang out with people as much. For them, it's a lot of times it's that community because otherwise, a lot of the people, and I think it ties back into the general culture too, that a lot of people outside of that, then they just feel alone. So like those things they take it very seriously because it is their bonding time, right? It is their time to really connect and get away from work, right? Well, Ramses doesn't care about that, dude. But anyways, like, but yeah, but it's like there's a depth to it, man. That a lot of these people, like you see it all the time in Japan. It's not uncommon to see the salary man. You get off of work and I'm sitting in an arcade and I'm playing I'm playing and jamming. That is my time to relax, right? It's a combination of that and also like drinking a lot of times if you're of age, that are really big like social interactions out there, and it translates really well. And I think it's one of the it's clearly like that culture is the reason why they're in such a good place, and I also think that's the reason why you see such unification amongst a lot of the people and why they've been able to grow in a space where you look at they don't even make money from tournaments, right? They're not making money from these tournaments, right? And so it has nothing to do with those kind of sponsors, and yet they have strong sponsors that care because no matter what, it is still something that's valued as marketing. It's a unified front. People work and do content together, and so you have a lot of these players who are actually living off this stuff fairly well, right? And in a very good spot, and translating it to getting tech jobs and gaming jobs and all these kind of things, right? Like I talked about Ayoha before. Ayoha is someone really strong, really passionate about supporting this scene. He's been at Twitch now for quite some time. And a part of that was because of his relationship with building and cultivating the Japanese scene. Umebura, right? Even Umeki. I'm not sure where he's exactly working, but I know it's like gaming related. And he's able to build these things as well, and it translates directly. And they've been able to build a sustainable ecosystem together, and I think that's a very beautiful thing, and we don't really see that in too many other countries, I would say, to that scale. I will say, like, I feel like from what I've seen, like from France and how they've been building up a lot of things out there as well, too, they're getting there. Their esports is still, in terms of that scale, is still relatively young in comparison to other nations, but the way they do it, I feel like it's better and it's more unified. And I think we're starting to see that returns even from the events that have been going on out there. But long-winded answer to say, like, I think it's sick that they've built this ecosystem, and because of that, not only have they been able to find a sustainable space for their people, they've really cultivated a Smash home for all the people who love Smash there, even for the old heads, and that translates into the level of play because they always got people hungry, coming together, trying to learn and break down the game the best way possible. And it's a beautiful thing. And I know sometimes people meme about that stuff and they'll be like, oh, haha, well, everything's just better because someone saying Japan. It's like, yes, there's some stuff that's just straight up a meme because you can find certain aspects of these things in other avenues, other cultures, other countries, right? And that's why I made a point to even call it like France in terms of what they've been able to build and grow and cultivate out there from what I've seen. And you see that in some other places too, and like the DR, what they've been able to build and stuff. But there's all these other avenues that they've had with the infrastructure for the internet, close proximity, the sponsors, et cetera, that have allowed them to build this great space that brings out the best of the best. So it's a delight to see. Honestly, I left feeling happy, and also it's kind of bittersweet because I'm like, damn, man, I really, yeah, I know. Technically it was like 3 days, but still, it was terrible.
There long enough to get used to the jet lag and then go find some more.
Yeah, just long enough to remind myself how upset I am, honestly, as sometimes at the lack of unity in the ironically named United States. So that's how I feel about that.
So ultimately, I think one of the things that really comes down to it is the risk of being reductive. If you want to judge growth of a competitive community, like in terms of on a world stage, you follow the money. So I think that's one of the simplest factors that you can find to correlate expected growth is tracking where the money's going, and then you can expect to see a bump in performance, if only just because it allows the players who are already trying their best to be able to put a little bit more of what that best is, put a little bit more resources into it, however that contributes. I would argue that the way US invested their infrastructure for events was not the wisest, and that has not paid off accordingly just because it fell with the things that fell without going into specifics. So I think that I definitely am excited to see not just France, because France is definitely they're on the rise, as Jay mentioned, but also I'm very excited to see the Latin American communities are starting to rise up, and we might not even see it within Ultimate's lifespan, but within the next coming years, I would not be surprised to see Latin America standing at the top of the stage with Japan, just like we're starting to see with, I'm saying starting, as we have seen in the last year or two with Mexico, for example. Because as a reminder, Mexico used to be relegated as a minor subregion. And Europe, there was a point in time where Europe was considered on the same level of northeastern United States, where it's just like a quadrant of a real region. And it's not that Europe wasn't good then. It's just a matter of, I think that most regions on the world stage get disrespected until they force people to respect them. And the same thing happens with Japan. So I don't think that Japan started
on the world stage.
Yeah.
On the American stage. Let's be fair.
Yeah, the U.S.
Yeah.
And
the U.S.
stage,
we are the
was
world.
The U.S. going to Japan and getting their asses beat in Japan. So the world stage was in Japan. So that's why I'm calling it the world stage.
Yeah. That's fair.
Like that's where we saw the comparison there. So there's definitely a U.S. centric bias, but where that stage is tends to vary based on, again, where the money goes. And originally the money was seen in the U.S. And so we would see that in the U.S. But as there's bigger European tournaments, as there's bigger Latin American tournaments, things like Smash Factor coming up here.
Yeah, I mean, we're the biggest esports country, so like as now. So I mean, it's understandable. Yes, it's annoying. Yes, it's a travesty, especially for our brothers not in the U.S. But like you said,
I don't mind, but I mean, call it like it is. You know, like even when a tournament is Japan or is centered in Japan, the opinions are centered around the US. You know what I mean? Like that's where the voices are come from. That's where the that's where you're judged basically, right? Like even if you're a great European player, oftentimes a lot of how you're seen in the community depends on how the US reacts to you. And there are like sub pockets of communities that like form their own opinions, of course, but I'm talking more about like the quote unquote zeitgeist in terms of Smash. Anyway, I legitimately don't mind, but I think calling it a world stage it's just like not an accurate representation of the actual like how it's formed. And I think what is cool about Japan is that they're kind of they are self-contained enough to be separate from all of that.
Yeah.
So it is not going to look that way to me because my lens are fundamentally biased from the US because I stay in the US and I consume Smash from the lens of the US. So the calling it like it is from my perspective is inherently going to be biased. So calling it like it is just going to be from a US centric perspective, no matter what the perspective is, because it's coming from me.
That's fair.
Right. And I think when you say world stage, it's like we're essentially a tournament or a stage with world-class talent, right? And I think Kagaribi 10 was exactly that. Obviously, a lot of North American talent and Australian talent came out as well. So that was really cool to see. A reason why this is so rare, by the way, and we keep bringing up, I think a lot of the times during this episode, we're going to bring up the general infrastructure of esports within Smash. And in Japan, there is no prize money. If you don't know, now you know. There's no prize money for Japanese tournaments. Usually the winner gets like a bag of rice or something like that. Traditionally, that's what they get. Or
High-end rice.
Oh, it's high-end. It's the winner rice. But like I think it's against the law, right? It's considered gambling if you put into a pot and then someone wins it or something like that. Which, obviously Japan's saying, the country of Japan is saying that if you win, you just got lucky in Japan. Right?
They pretty much say you're all ass and it's, you just got lucky. But I mean, and this is something that even goes into, and of course, if we're talking about the infrastructure here on the esports side, you got to really dive into you got to zoom out a bit, right? You got to talk about even the fighting game, the license that they were getting, the esports license that they're trying to do. That like people like Momochi was like pushing for, right? And along with a bunch of other people. I think that Bon China was also a part of that too. A couple other guys as well. I think Kazunoka maybe was trying to support that as well. But like a bunch of these guys were really trying to push forward and get Japan to that state. Because ironically, despite what people may think, Japan is really big. Obviously, the culture in gaming in Japan is huge. Their culture on esports is very new, right? And it's not but obviously because you have that overarching gaming culture, it has grown exponentially since they've started to see it as something more reasonable. Even though for the most part, the country still sees it as just kind of gambling.
Which is so weird to me because Korea is very close to Japan, and Korea is
China,
right? And both Korea and China, I think, I don't know too much about China, but I know Korea was one of the forefront countries of esports, right? Back in like StarCraft Brood War, they were one of the first countries to really like put on a stage. Like they had, I remember when I was a kid, I would watch Brood War esports, right? And they would have these players in like these soundproof cubicles. The crowds would be going crazy, so they have to put them in soundproof cubicles and stuff like that, and they'll be competing and like confetti and all the bells and whistles. And I mean, that was like a long time ago, over 20 years ago. So it's just so weird to me that some of these countries, and then I would assume China was also like more on the forefront of the.
They were the biggest esports country before we
like Dota and stuff like that, right? If I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, like just overall, like they were the big one. Yeah, so like Korea is a big like forefront. China became the number one esports like country, and then over time we overtook them we like kind of just grew exponentially. But yeah, it is very to your point. It's very interesting that like
Japan did not adopt any of that.
Countries, right? And then like Japan being known as like the place where games are made, right? Obviously, we've transitioned from that, and there's so many different developers all across the world. But the influence of Japanese gaming can never be overstated. And it's very interesting that you would find something like esports that is competitive gaming that would be so underdeveloped in that country. But again, because of the overall gaming culture, it has grown quickly as people have started to push more into esports.
Yeah. A lot of individuals, right? Even companies like Red Bull. I know there's like a gaming sphere out there and stuff like that. So even trying to spread that kind of like esports influence, I think that's a very big deal, right? And we're starting to see it with Smash. I think the main income for a lot of these players are the sponsors. So now they're starting to get sponsors that pay them, right? And I even remember at one of the first summits, like first or second summits, Zach Ray's esports like manager, his team manager, came up to me and asked me a bunch of questions about YouTube. He was like, yeah, Zach Ray is not too sure about if he should go to college because his parents want him to go to college, and that's like the normal thing to do. But like, no one in Japan has ever just like did full-time esports. I think the closest thing was like ABBA, or like within Smash. Obviously, there's like Daigo and the other like amazing FGC players that kind of paved the way for just esports in general in Japan. But within Smash, I mean, the only one that was like really killing it out there back then was Abadango, right? And I got to talk to Abba at just like hanging out with him.
That was so funny to see. That line, dude.
Abba's line. It was crazy. Like Abba didn't even get top 8, and this was like day 1. And there was people like asking other top players like Mia, Cola, Spargo for like autographs and stuff like that. Abadango had a line out the door. I wanted to say what's up to Abadango at the tournament, but I didn't even get a chance to because he was like that busy. Like that dude is like he felt like the most famous person in the room. Let's just put it that way. So I love to see that because Abba, Abba's just one of the he's my favorite Japanese player. He's the most American Japanese player I know. Let's just put it that way. So
he's a homie for sure, man. Shouts to Abadango, dude. All good guy. And one of the first people to really kind of be known out here, right? He was the first to win a Smash Major ?
In Smash 4, yes.
In the US?
Well, there's
or am I wrong?
Otori.
Oh yeah. Sorry. Besides
that's why I said Smash 4.
Brawl. Yeah, Smash 4. Yeah.
In Smash 4, yes.
Yeah.
And then Brawl was Otori, and then
esports wasn't real in Brawl days, so no one cared about what we were doing. Unfortunately,
that's a whole nother subject. That was Otori's first ever tournament win. So like,
yes,
crazy.
It was OD. Yeah,
but back to me talking to Zachary's like manager, and he like asked me honestly, he was like, do you think Zachary could make a living off of content, off of YouTube? Because that's what he's kind of thinking about, because he's seeing Abadango's success and he's thinking maybe he can do that and focus mainly on that. And I was like, and at the time I was managing Void's YouTube, so I kind of understood a good amount of like the early metagame for Smash YouTube and stuff like that. So I was honest with him. I was like, oh yeah, I think he could probably be one of the most successful YouTube channels because he's just the young prodigy from Japan, you know what I mean? And he played a wide variety of characters. Like you're hitting all the check marks, right? Like if you can play a wide variety of characters, you can be entertaining, and I mean you're
and he's a god gamer.
Yeah.
And he's a god gamer.
I didn't know that back then. Like he apparently he can just play any game and he'd be really good.
Yeah, him and Void are one of the Didn't they say they sometimes call him the Japanese Void out there? Because it's the same thing where like both of them are just insanely good at games and they never feel uncomfortable playing a game.
So now these top players have an ecosystem. You got to realize in Brawl and Smash 4, it's like Bam was saying, it was very common to just be like, all right, I'm off of work, go to a tournament, in Tokyo, boom, 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 right? And we didn't really get to see the skill ceiling of Japan really climb upwards until Ultimate, in my opinion, because Smash 4 is because they're just playing within a bubble, right? And then Smash 4, they start to go outside of that bubble and like compete within, like outside of Japan and improve and get better, right? Because all the best players will go where the money is, which is why Kagaribi 10, a bunch of North American players going there is so rare, because usually players go where the money is, right? Because when you're going to travel that far, it's got to be quote unquote worth it, right? So, I mean, shout out to all the NA players that went out to Kagaribi 10. Like even though there was no prize pool, that was like very cool, very sick
Yeah.
to see. So,
Mhm.
and because of that, back in Smash 4, the players go out, travel, experience playing against, the tippy top of the meta, which was, all the US tournaments. They come back, they can train up more, and they've improved more, and they've kind of seen what they have to beat, right? And then that continues throughout Smash 4, continues throughout Ultimate. And once that happens so many times, it's like, okay, all right, guys, like we know what we need to do. And it feels like Japan, it feels like their region or their country is more like a team. And even when it comes to content, they promote each other's content a lot. Like they help each other a lot at locals and just improving at the game. Their Smash Fests are very constructive. They like lab stuff together. So I think the unity and the camaraderie really helps the region, especially when it comes to content and stuff like that too. So now there's like an ecosystem where they can maybe put more time into the game, go more full time into the game. That's a more realistic thing because in Brawl and Smash 4, that was not even on the table. So now that they have all they have all these benefits of good public transportation, good internet. Now it's snowballing because now they can put more time into the game, and I feel like Japan being the best region is something that started they started this grind all the way back in Brawl, and now you're seeing the fruition of it, which is so beautiful. And it's like so sick to see. What is your opinion, Ramses, on Japan? Japan's man. We can jump into another topic, like going more into specific like playstyle stuff.
Characters.
But we kind of went over like the infrastructure and like all of the more historic stuff. So now we can kind of pivot into more playstyle stuff if you want to do that.
It's funny. Meru, you guys know Meru.
I met Meru
player
out there.
Oh, awesome, dude. He's lovely.
Cool.
I hope you guys had a good time with Meru.
We did.
He went to Japan for his studies in September of last year, if I remember correctly. And he's been going to locals for a couple of months. I think he's taking a break right now, but I've been working with him when he came to Japan because he took a bit of a break, right? A little bit of motivation loss after COVID. But being back in Japan made him motivate again. So I kind of helped him through the improvement in Japan. And it was kind of what you guys said, like the skill gaps there are way lower and the skill floor is way higher. But what I've also noticed through helping him at his locals and reviewing his games is that the way Japan approaches improvements is just so fundamentally different than the US or Europe for that matter. But I don't think Europe is even in the discussion here. I think their methods are different and not necessarily better. I think it's just something that has a different kind of like curve in terms of like your skill, your improvement. So when I look at Japanese players, I feel
sorry
like
to interject, but I would actually like to hear like not just the US and Japan, but I would like to hear like the Europe like style play as well too. Because I always thought that was always fundamentally like interesting. Like,
Use on the come up too, man. Don't sleep on Europe, bro.
I actually do want to hear your opinion on that fact. I don't want you to disregard that. But yeah, go ahead.
Let's get into Japan first, and then we can talk about like the comparison to the regions, right? So the thing that I noticed with Japanese players is that they focus a lot on kind of like optimizing their game plan and their character knowledge because they have like a great tool to practice with Smashmate. The thing about online, just before anyone in the comments goes crazy, like the issue with Ultimates Online has always been that there's like a set input delay to make sure that like if there are hiccups, it doesn't really affect the gameplay. Like they've added a bit of input delay to like every match just for the sake of like having clean connections. And so in Japan, as far as I know, I could be wrong, but as far as I know, they don't really mess with modding. And so if you're in the US or in Europe and you have the delay mod and you're playing with people within a decent radius, you have a better Wi-Fi experience than they have in Japan. So like they have better internet. Like it's kind of true as in like you have more potential practice partners, but you're going to get a better connection if you're playing with the delay mod. I'm just saying. But nevertheless, their biggest advantage is that they have a site on which they have an elo system on which a lot of people participate, and they just have like a huge scene that are all very close together. And so what you get is that everyone knows every matchup to some degree. And because you know so many different matchups, you understand a lot of different aspects of your character, right? Because usually in various matchups, you learn about various aspects of your character. Like, if you're playing Fox against Game Watch, you're going to be learning like an entirely different style of Fox that you can then apply to like other matchups, right? So when I was working with Meru, I noticed that everyone was very good at basically building a very optimal game plan. But the kind of side effect is that because the Japanese meta is so safe, and like I remember seeing a video by, I think it was Zachary, like a few years ago, where he said you should never make a read. And like I looked at it and I was like, all right, Zachary, maybe not my favorite take, but like it makes a lot of sense about why the Japanese play the way they do. Because the thing is, if your opponent doesn't go for reads, you don't need them either, right? And what you kind of get is you get a country full of Dark Souls bosses. You get a country full of Dark Souls bosses where once you understand where they're strong and weak, they become relatively straightforward to fight. Not easy, straightforward, right? Just like a Dark Souls boss, but you mess up once and you take like half your HP bar, right? Or you mess up your stamina management and you explode. So you like, that is what makes Japan so scary. Is like everyone's a Dark Souls boss. And if you're not, if you don't know how the Dark Souls boss works, in other words, if you don't know the matchup, you're going to lose like weekly after weekly until you learn. And so, you like what you notice is that a lot of the players there do things with their character that people in the US or Europe for that matter don't really attempt to do because they're focused on other areas of the game. So that's like the more practical aspect. Something that I noticed in terms of like the more emotional aspect is that I feel like the Japanese players have and this, I think this is a cultural thing, but they approach ego a lot differently. So when losing, they generally are more open to feedback and they're more open to the idea that they just are worse and that there's more to learn. Whereas I feel like in Western countries, more often do you see things like complaining on social media, saying that it was janky. Exactly, right? It's very much like I'm gonna deflect to protect my ego. Whereas in Japan, like losing or being wrong, it feels like less of a bad thing. Again, like I'm not from Japan, I don't know the actual cultural context, but talking with Meru and to some degree Ramin as well, I'm noticing a pattern in that people are generally like more focused on the improvement part and less focused on like the personal investment in improving. And so what you get again is you get like when something goes wrong, they learn more quickly and you get like this positive feedback loop. So those are like that is basically my opinion on like Japanese skill level, is that like oftentimes you find that like the mid-level in Western regions are focused on a lot of different things, whereas the mid-level in Japan it's all like polish, become that Mega Man boss, the Dark Souls boss, whatever you want to call it, and then kind of go from there. In terms of comparison to the US and Europe, so when I look at American playstyles, especially when I look at mid and even to some degree high level, I feel like the focus is way more on control. So a lot of the players will focus on basically asserting control over every interaction possible rather than optimizing every interaction possible, which leads to a very different dynamic where it's more about risk reward and it's more about like using player reads to kind of like facilitate that control. And it also leads to situations where you get away with murder because your opponent is just not focused on like optimizing the matchup or a character, et cetera, et cetera. And in Europe, if you want to know, Bam, it's actually a lot harder to talk about because whereas in the US, I feel like you can attribute a meta to North America as a region. Of course, like it's going to differ per individual sub-region, and like I don't have enough nuance to know about that. But I feel for Europe, and this is probably my bias, but I struggle to really assign a playstyle to Europe as a whole, because I feel like if you look at the UK, the players are generally pretty methodical. Think about like Bloom and Pelly and Lugi. Whereas if you look at France, they're a lot more like the US, right? A lot more control focused, a lot more button heavy, a lot more read heavy. And then if you go to something like the Netherlands, again, you get like more of a methodical playstyle. I know when Riddles came to Wanted, he played Ramin, me, Super Semi, and Space, and he was like, "You guys just camp. What the heck?" So I find it hard to like look at Europe as a whole, but I think so. Like personally, I'm probably a bit negative on European skill level, but I think the main thing that I'm noticing across all of the European regions is that it's just like generally pretty unoptimized because of the lack of practice, right? So like in the US, you have a huge player base. In Japan, you have a huge player base. The European player base is just a lot smaller, which means that you don't like the meme, put a European against Olimar. That goes for Game Watch as well, right? Like, find a European with Game Watch experience, like, please, outside of Gluttony, of course. Or like a Joker. So what you find is that like a lot of the European playstyles are very unrefined because they haven't been face to face with optimized playstyles in general, because a lot of the European countries have such like what's the right word? Isolated. I was going to use a different word. They have such isolated metas that, like, if you're French, you're not used to like more methodical or polished playstyles. Whereas if you're from the UK, you're not used to more like control heavy, button heavy playstyles. So like that's one thing. And another thing is because they don't play as many matchups, you often find that they just haven't developed their character as deeply as they could, because there are certain aspects of their character that they just never had to deal with because they never had a matchup in which they had to like play around those options. So for example, when you see the French play against Steve, you very often see these flaws come up because Steve as a character, it just kind of forces you to play to very specific parts of your character, and not a lot of other characters will force you to rely on those tools. So you see the French players generally struggle against Steve because of these reasons. So that all aside, focusing back on Japan, I think it is a way more powerful baseline to be a Dark Souls boss, because once you're a Dark Souls boss, you can then learn to become a different type of Dark Souls boss, and then you can decide which Dark Souls boss you want to be in the moment. And once you're at that point, you actually like that's already like basically at like top 100 level in the world. And that's what you're seeing in like the top level of Japan is that they've gotten more aggressive, right? Like they've taken learnings from the US playstyle, especially in a really good way. But they haven't like switched their playstyle entirely. It's more like we now make adjustments on like the strategical level to the degree necessary. I think they're still like erring on the side of caution, right? Where they're playing like more reserved than they could be. But overall, I think it's a good sign for the future, because if you looked at Japan like a year ago, I would say like their biggest weakness is that they don't make the read when they need to. They don't control the situations when they could be, right. Like they'll be like, of course they control when they're stronger, but when they're weaker, they will never like overstep. But right now you see like, especially a player like Shuton or someone like Ken, they will be cheeky and like overstep their boundaries just to see if they get away with it. And I think it's a good adaptation.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, even if you remember in Kagaribi, T losing to Tama P, freaking dive kick. Usually no Japanese player is just straight up freaking full hop dive kick into the kill to secure the freaking set game, right? And just a side note, I think also, I think it's just a product of where you live, right? Where in my eyes, there definitely is like a difference between the different like states and the coast. But obviously, I've lived out here, so I would know that. But there's a difference between like how West Coast used to play and East Coast, and even the South. Obviously, I think the West and East Canada play differently too. Even what kind of play styles you're going to see in like Mexico City and stuff as whatnot. But I do think because of more travel and because of there being so many events out in the stateside, we've become a bit more homogenized in that way. So I think there was a lot back in the day. It was very distinct. Where like,
oh yeah, brawl, woof.
Oh yeah, it was like completely different, right? And it's funny too because you would find that even in traditional fighters, right? Or West Coast is rush that shit down. Shout outs to freaking Alex Valle, and then it's like then you got the slow patient Justin Wong and all Chris G's of the world, right? But we had a similar sentiment as well, where you had people kind of like the rush down style, and then you'd find freaking like slow methodical people, even like just some of the different meta knights that emerged as like a counter to all the other super safe campy people. Like Naruto was a player that was really, really aggressive, but he was aggressive because he played so many people who were camping all day, right? And so he kind of learned to get that style, right? But I do agree with you absolutely on your call out in terms of Japanese play styles, and I think that a lot of those players understood that too, right? And as you saw it, as those players kind of like they were like, okay, I want to take that read, I want to take that risk, right? And again, I think I do believe a lot of this is kind of ingrained with our culture and what we perceive, right? Like I'm going to take the very structured approach here. I'm going to do this. I'm not going to go outside of those bounds. That's stupid. Why would I do that? There's no need to take that risk, right? Whereas America is all about like, you have to take the risk, because if you don't take the risk, you're not going to win it all, right? And
the American dream, baby.
Yeah, the American dream, baby. You can win it all. We never talk about what if you do that and lose everything. Like no one's like, right? Like but it's just like it's foundational, right? In terms of what we perceive as the like what we truly want to achieve, what matters in the world. So yeah, I always find that fascinating amongst different countries, what they perceive, like what matters and what is impactful to them. And it does translate into games. I mean, I think that's one of the most beautiful things about fighting games, honestly, man, just to see that translation in terms of our ideals and our wants and our dreams, right? It really can be represented in playstyles. But yeah, it's been cool to see that in the Japanese players, like you said, bringing over some of that more play style, bringing in a more inherent risk, changing of those tempos, and they've been able to take that in with their high like their auto like their skill floor, right, and being high as is, and yeah, they've been able to find like insane return. But like Tony, I'd love to hear what your opinion on that is too on the Japanese play style.
So I'm going to go ahead and steal a quote from it. I think it was Midace said in that a lot of the Japanese playstyle is industrialized, and that they take the model, they put it down, they pour some nice quality material into the mold, put it on the conveyor belt, and crack the next one out. Very consistent, very good. Unfortunately, as with everything else, all things have weaknesses and all strengths have trade-offs. And a trade-off to having a uniform play approach is that if you can counter one, you can counter a lot of them. And that's part of the reason why we have players who, when they do beat the Japanese players who come over, they beat them all.
Beat them all. Yep.
Yeah. So, and it's not necessarily consistent on which players. Like, for example, like you can't tell me they don't have R.O.B practice in Japan, because they have Zachary. He's probably the most reactive R.O.B with down tilt, has some of the most impressive ground play, and you still see Zomba just absolutely clean up on all of them. Like he generally wins against Japan. Light generally wins against Japan, like you said, Luis. Like these players just do well and they clean up house. And so it's not like Japan just has some hit squad for these specific players. It's a matter of the encounters themselves are not things that Japan experiences. So for the players who play similar to that conveyor belt style that they're used to, it's an uphill battle. Like a lot of the safe players from the US go into Japan. Japan has faced 1,000 players just like you. Like it's just another day. Yeah. And it's not that you're not skilled. It's just a matter of they're ready for you. Are you ready for them? And so I think that part of what is actually successful for the Japanese is because I believe that the general mold that Japanese players tend to use is probably the most effective if you are playing in a vacuum. Like if both players aren't prepared for each other, then I think that that's the best way to play the game. Because the risk reward is good, you're dice, and then if you're not using reads, then obviously a set in which reads are less important because neither player has a particularly large amount of information coming into the match, then that's just the best way you're going to play the game. And that reflects in the West as well. So like in Mexico, in the US, in Europe, I think that the best players tend to also play similarly. And I think that that's just the best way to play in a vacuum, in my opinion. So that is not without a counter, though. And so the players who can make reads, the players who can gather that information ahead of time are going to be prepared for that. They're going to counter it. And when they do counter it, they're going to win. And so that's not to say that this applies to every single Japanese player by any means. So even though there is a generalization you can make there, not every Japanese player is the same. There's plenty of Japanese players who play contrary to this and are also capable of learning, gathering information beforehand, having game plans for opponents that they haven't played against before, et cetera, et cetera. Obviously, you have very good download players like Akala, like Kameme, where they're just because you beat them in one tournament, if you run into them in losers, it's a whole other kind of set. So, don't get it twisted. It's not that there's just one blueprint for all Japanese players, but in general, that is a dynamic that I see at play a lot. Likewise, just because the U.S. players are not used to running into random top U.S. players that are actually from Japan, which is essentially how it was described. So when I talked to any of the players who traveled over there for Kagaribi, it was basically explained to, it felt like I was running into someone that I should have known was in existence and wasn't. So they basically ran into a top player who they just weren't prepared for, but was prepared for them. And so I think the most consistent feeling that for at least the buzz, I think certainly portrayed well, is that once they had more time and they got some more exposure to that level of play, they did go back to their normal results of consistency. It's just a matter of it caught them off guard when they first went over there. And I think that if you gave the players like a couple of weeks in Japan to acclimate to the meta, that they would adapt just fine, and you would see them reclaim the same results that they get in Europe, in the US, in Mexico. And so I don't think it's a matter of, oh, well, the best players in X region would go O2 in Japan. Like, that might be a true statement, but if they spend enough time there, like, I don't think it's a coincidence that we saw players like Jay Dizzle still making and keeping up with the best players in the US at the same tournament. And I think it's because Jay Dizzle has had the time to acclimate, and he's also a good player, and he's able to make those adaptations. And I don't think that you can compare the level of resources available to improve in Australia with something in the West, Europe, or even in Latin America. Like, Australia's, despite being near relatively Japan, that is a region that it has to go very far with relatively very little resources. And they do make do, and good on them for doing that. Jay Dizzle made an amazing run.
He did.
An insane challenge to just make it out of pools, much less make it into touching the top 32. So I do think Japan is probably the strongest region right now. I don't know that they're going to finish that way in Ultimate. I'm not saying that they won't, but I don't think that the best region in Ultimate has been the same at any point, or any 2 years, I'd say. So I think it started out with the US being the best region. I think that Mexico was probably the best region coming back from COVID. I think that's safe to say. And I think Japan has done a nice job catching up. I think that there's a very large number of players who will probably never be credited. A lot of people who might not even be known as players who put in work in Japan, and that the collective efforts of Japan are what are paying off. There's also some exemplary Japanese players, of course, but I don't think it's as clear cut as, there's just everybody in Japan is amazing. I think that there's a case of, I believe the expression is something to the effect of, it takes a village to raise a good child.
Oh,
and
yeah.
There's a whole lot of villages in Japan, and they're doing their parts.
They definitely are, man. Yeah. And I think that's why it's important to really start off with, discussing the overall unification of the scene out there. Because, I completely agree with you. It is not just, everyone in Japan is just randomly good just because. And they're just built different, bro. They're just built like Hajime Mashite. They're just built different, bro. Like, something stupid.
Bro.
Dude,
Shut up.
No, I'm gonna say because people are stupid. People are dumb, all right, and they don't look at people as actual human beings, and it's actually really stupid.
True.
And I can't stand that. I can't stand that people are disregarding the effort and the work that these people put in. Right? It isn't this huge freaking monolith walking around doing this. Right? Yes, it's a community. Yes, a lot of them play similar ways because they look at the game and they kind of build as a team, but this does not mean that these aren't individuals out here building and crafting things together and coming together to make something happen, right? And I think that's very, very important to discern, because I do think that people have this, and by people, I'm mainly talking to the U.S. because a lot of them just don't know and they don't travel nearly enough, which happens. But it's like people need to really look at the beauty of this game, and just so many individuals out there from different cultures and stuff making things happen, and just like they're putting in efforts to get to where they are, right? So I do think it's good to say that, because I do believe that there's people out there that think that, oh, Japan was just always just like there. They were just the best, obviously. And then it's like, now you guys just got to see it, right? Yeah. Oh, dude, I saw.
I knew back in Brawl.
I'm telling you, dude. I saw on Twitter so many people were like, "Yeah, see, y'all didn't know. Now you just went there. Now you see." It's like, no, these guys have been working at it, man. I don't know if you guys know, but like some of the top players were getting body when they were coming out here for sometimes, and they were just like obviously, with relative, right? But it was like, like, damn, all right, we got to go back and we kind of got to level up, man. Like, this MK Leo character is kind of nice. Like, like what do we need to do to get better? Like, we need to see the game a little bit differently, what we need to work at, right? And it was interesting too, because you could even see it in the love that a lot of the Japanese community had for a lot of the top players that were coming there, because they've been watching, they've been seeing them play, they've been learning, they've been studying these guys, man. And I think you made a great point there, Tony, where it's like, yeah, like these guys felt like they ran into a top player that was prepared for them and they weren't prepared for them. And it's like, part of that is because, yeah, these guys have been studying, man. They've been in the lab. They've been focused. They've been working on it. And they've been growing as everyone has been growing, as all these scenes have been growing. And even the same thing, right, with like Gluto and like all these players coming through, and people like, oh, well, these guys are Penguins, blah, 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 blah. And then it's like, oh, wait, when people have resources and they have a billion tournaments and they can go to things, wait, these guys were actually good and they just needed practice and actual practice partners and more opportunities. Wow. So shocker. It's insane that life works that way.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, go ahead. Go, please.
I was going to add something. So since Smash 4, I've had this like idea that a lot of skill in a region is like trickle down. It's like trickle down economics, but for skill. Mm-hmm. So I remember back in Smash 4, like no one in Europe traveled to the US, right? Like it was just Ramin. So Ramin would come back and stay in the Netherlands for a couple of weeks every so often for his mom's birthday or to reset his visa, stuff like that. And what I noticed is that every time he came back, he brought with him basically the current meta, because he was a top 10 player in Smash 4, right? Mm-hmm. So he would come back and he would like let's trap the shit out of every Dutch player, and then like he would go back to the US after like 2 weeks, and then like everyone would like improve on the let's trapping, because you've been let's trapped by how it works, how oppressive it is. Now you learn yourself, right? Yep. And then people would copy, and then he would come back and then he would show you how to counter his let's trapping, and then everyone would start a counter let's, right? So like every single time he would come and he would give that knowledge, and then like the people he would play, which is like 5 people, would learn, and then those 5 people play with 5 people each, and then like it trickles down. And I feel like that is what always made the US so strong, is that because you had so many different subregions that all kind of developed their own meta, you had like at every major a pretty significant exchange of meta information, right? Because like you're taking something from Tri-State, you're taking something from SoCal, you're taking something from the South, you're taking something from the Pacific Northwest, and then like like Mars goes to an event, comes back, practices with Light learns all the same shit. They practice with Axiom, etc. And then like that, like regions have become really strong. And I feel like for Japan especially, because they had that like the Dark Souls boss development, when you bring new meta knowledge and you apply it to such a strong foundation of play, where like your risk reward has been optimized, your situations are optimized, your matchup knowledge is optimized, it becomes that much more effective. Yeah. Because like if you think about it, and this is a gross oversimplification, but I think it's one that holds up well enough. You can think about your play as like 2 elements, right? There's like the vehicle and the pilot. And so in Japan, like the vehicle is like super developed, always super developed. So when you take new piloting options and you add it to like the latest vehicle, it's gonna be a race car. So that's really what the Japanese have been doing, in my opinion, is like just improving the piloting aspect of play. And I think now it's time for the US and the rest of the West to improve their vehicle, because I think in essence, outside of like select few top players, someone who comes to mind is Sonics. I think Sonics has probably the best developed vehicle in the world at the moment.
I would agree with
but
that.
but yeah, but like outside of him in the West, there are almost no players who I'm like, you're playing your character 100%. Exactly. Yeah. Whereas in Japan, people come really darn close. It's just that their piloting skills, it's just not as much part of the meta there. Whereas in the West, you can see like Cola, for example, Cola will make plays that like blow your socks off. Like, holy moly, how do you do that? And that's something that is also like super impressive, but it's always like a balance of the two, right? The pilot and the vehicle. And it's cool. It's cool. It's like a clash of two different cultures, right? Like who's going to win, the best cars or the best pilots? Yeah. And right now the best cars are going fast, bro.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But we see that in tons of things, like in skills and art around the world, right? That's how cuisine gets exchanged, right? That's how you can be for whatever. Why does Peruvian have like they have their cuisine that like utilizes a lot of soy sauce. Like, why is that, right? Like, or they have like different dance styles and how we get the emergence of these things, right? Of how like you go like, oh, okay, you're getting breakdancing that's getting over to Japan and it comes back, and then now people are learning different techniques from there. Like, there's so many, like, it is just, that's globalization, right? And that's the beauty of it, to see these exchange of these cultural ideas through the lens of a skill or an art and activity, right? And it's so fire. Like I love that shit, dude. That's the shit that gets me hyped, dude. When people get that shit and it's like, you don't even know what you're doing. You're like, you don't even know that you learned this from this guy that learned from this guy from this guy that actually got it from this guy all the way across the world, and you don't even know.
Down.
Yeah,
it trickled down. Yeah.
You think Joe 212 just blasted you with some hard new read and you ever seen it before, and you don't know that he learned it from this guy, from this guy, from this guy. But that's how
that's why. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's why Japanese or the Japanese are so cracked, because like they're more unified as a region because it's one country, one language, generally one culture. As far as I know there's minor cultural differences between regions.
I mean, Japan is pretty homogenized in comparison to most countries in the world.
More so than like the U.S. or Europe as a continent. So trickling down, it just spreads wider because it's more unified, right? Like if Ramin comes back to the Netherlands, that knowledge stays within the Netherlands. If Mars comes back to New England, the knowledge stays within New England. But if Shuton comes back to Japan, that's going to reach like thousands of players because of how their scene works. So I think that really, like what Charles was talking about at the beginning of the session when he said like they've been putting in work since Brawl and this is the fruits of that. I think that unification or you know the remaining unification, I think that is really, really powerful, because like don't forget, the bigger a scene gets, the more easily it's fractured. Like in Brawl, it was like, oh, tri-state, but now no, it's New York. It's not tri-state, it's New York, because like it's a bigger scene. There are more subgroups. You get more fractured naturally, and Japan as a whole just stayed together as a team so well, which I think is just a sign of how their culture works, which I think is really, really cool.
Absolutely. So we're a little over 1 hour, so we'll just do around the horn. Just quick closing statements. I can start off. So the Japanese scene in general, very inspirational. Even just being there in person, I thought the crowd was really sick. They got excited. Obviously, they were biased more towards Japanese players because they want to see the Japanese players get the upsets. But there was also times where if someone was just doing something really sick, or if like they were doing something optimal, or just, you know, we were just seeing really good Smash Brothers, they would also applaud. Like when Void got onto the stream and doing his set, they started cheering for Void. And even when Spargo was on stage, like they cheered a lot for Spargo because it's just really good Smash Brothers, right? Even for the buzz, right? So a lot of appreciation for the game. And if you guys don't know, events like Kagaribi and Umebora sell out instantly. It's very hard just to get a spectator pass or a competitor pass. So hopefully we get to see these events get larger venues and grow in that case, because the demand is there, right? So really would like to see that. I don't know what the limitations are. I don't know all the statistics and stuff, but would really like to see these events get bigger venues, grow even bigger, and even the production has gotten so much upgrade. So really looking forward to that. What about you, Tony?
So for me personally, I actually do prefer the infrastructure in Japan, and I definitely remember back in Brawl making a push to focus on essentially favoring the O2 player base and factoring that as being the ultimate goal of an event. As a TO, not as a coach, obviously. As a coach, whoever I'm working with needs to get all the money, and that's how that works. So But the general rule of thumb is the less money that comes from attendees' pockets and or returns in the attendees' pockets, the more sustainable a region tends to be. And I think that kind of shows with Japan. It's not that they don't receive money in order to fund their players. It's more of just a matter of where that money comes from. It comes from an economic source that's less likely to be drained, that's less likely to specifically drain the attendees. And so I think that is going to give a bit more of a consistent basis. It's also worth noting that just the way the FGC interacts in Japan with the Smash community is different than how it does here in the US. Yep. So I think that you can't simply simplify it as just being a one-to-one as, oh, this is Japan and oh, this is the US, oh, this is Europe. Like, that's just not how it works. Like, there's a bunch of cultural differences. There's economic differences that the way those things intermingle are different. And I think it's a little bit too complicated to just put a bow on it. But with that said, I am grateful that Japan is playing as well as they do, that they continue to improve the way they do, and that they bring it to the US. And I look forward to seeing the way that the US, Latin America, Europe, Australia as well. And I think we're also starting to see like Northern Africa, some of the other Asian countries are starting to make a little bit more of an appearance. And I look forward to seeing a more globalized competition as competition continues. And I think that's very exciting. I'm looking forward to what Smash is becoming. And also, obviously, everybody here has, I think, a finger in the pie of seeing that what that's going to become. And that adds a little bit of extra ante to it, being able to personally interact with that and affect it.
Yeah, absolutely. You want to go ahead, Ramsey?
I was just going to say, I don't have a lot to add, but I do have a question. Ooh. Charles, did competitor Charles come out at Kagaribi?
No, actually, funny question.
One of us did.
Yeah, I would have. I actually was looking. I wanted to compete, and
me too.
And Bam also wanted to compete. We've been playing like a little bit more at events and stuff like that. So not like grinding a ton, but obviously we still love playing the game and stuff like that. And then competing in Japan, I think, is always just going to be a whole nother experience that you can't really go through, right? But someone who was supposed to put us into the bracket didn't put us into the bracket because they were a little busy. I'm not going to name drop anyone unless Bam wants to name drop them. But
they go Strides. Yes, I'm going to name drop them. The heck? Dude, we literally, and the worst part about it too is we thought we're in the bracket and we sit down with Strides. We're playing. We're like preparing. And literally Strides turns to us. He's like, hey, so are you guys entering the bracket? And we're like, wait, what?
Oh,
yeah. That is so Strides.
Yeah.
That is so Strides.
Like he said, like Charles said, he was hard at work.
He's busy.
Yeah. I know you guys asked a little bit ago if we had been like invited or whatever. Like a lot of it just ended up just going right. We went last second. Cool. The Void was like, oh, yo, Charles, I'm gonna go. Like, let's go together. Charles like, I'm down, and Charles like, yo, I'm going. I'm like, damn, I gotta go now. And that was like within a frame of like 2 weeks, right?
2 weeks before the event. Yeah, I'm still waiting for Gimmer to cut the check for commentary. I don't think he's kind of goes.
I don't think so.
So weird. He didn't reply yet, but
the YouTube royalties, bro. The YouTube royalties. You get 10%.
Yeah, very interesting. That was funny though. But yeah, I would say on my side, for me, I've always kind of been personally invested in that because, like said, like Aya is he's someone I've always respected at the very least.
It was cool seeing him.
I see him as someone kind of like that long distance friend, trying to commit to similar ideals and trying to help and cultivate their scene. And so just seeing that kind of passion result into action that results into building up a foundation that really has been a great livelihood for people is wonderful. I'm someone I want to see, like, I want people to feel like if they want Smash to be their home, it can be. If it's just a place for them to drop by in the house and have a good time with people and go, then they can. And I felt that at Kagaribi, and that made me very, very happy. It made me feel like this is not just for nothing. And I think that was a beautiful thing for me to see. I would love to see more, like, outside of just Japan. I would just love to see more unification in general across all branches, across all the scenes. Don't see it nearly enough. And to Ramsey's point, he was saying like as scenes grow, it's going to be more fractured because you're going to have more different personalities and egos going along with it and everything too. But I hope with everything that's gone on so far in the past few years that people are starting to realize like we can't keep doing this. It whittles down the scene every single time. And I think there's a good amount of leaders, especially in like the newer age, like of Smash, people who started since like kind of Brawl and all these things like that, that are beginning to grow tired and they're beginning to look to phase out. People can't do it forever. And I also think in that same breath, there's not as many leaders that are necessary for the scene to be in a good spot. And so, yeah, I think with the time that we have now, I don't think this is a forever window. I think it is possible to do things right with Nintendo. I think we need to stop blaming Nintendo and start looking at ourselves. Yes, if Nintendo came in and bullied everyone and said, hey, we need to do this, and it was the right thing to do. Gosh damn it, Paul. Stop calling me. Anyways. But
Freaking Paul.
Freaking Paul, man. Gosh damn it. Every time.
What the heck?
Yeah. It's probably about an event too or something. But I think people really need to sit down and look at their community and talk about what they really want to see from the scene, and if they love what they see from the scene currently, because a lot of TOs are getting to the point where it's like, I don't know if this is going to happen much longer from a financial standpoint, let alone from a just mental bandwidth, right? And people take a lot of stuff for granted. And it felt like when we were out in Kagaribi, it wasn't. And obviously, that's one tournament. It was a major tournament for them there. So the perspective that we have from that cannot, stand for everything potentially. But just from what I've seen, from the people I've talked to out there, and I want to see more of that everywhere. I don't want to see it just in Japan. I want to see it everywhere. There's a lot of people who fight very hard and struggle and strive to make a better place for a lot of people there. And the only way we do this is if we do it together. So that's my piece on that.
All right. Well, with that being said, that was this episode of Coach's Corner. I hope you guys enjoyed the content. Make sure to leave us a comment and tell us how you guys feel about Kagaribi 10 and the Japan meta in general. And until next time, class dismissed.